and I'm delighted to welcome you here to a rather hastily organized program with Dr. James Coyle. I'll introduce him in just a second. Obviously, we are keeping abreast of current events and what's happening in the news coming out of Ukraine and the Russian invasion. And so I thought we would open up an opportunity really exclusively to current students, our board members. I see board members on the screen here as well, supporters and alumni. And as we've just seen, we have one of our alumni checking in from Romania for this conversation. The format for this will be really very informal, and we do want this. I wanted to keep the group size here, again, pretty limited so we could have some really good engagement through Q&A. Dr. Coyle is going to begin with some comments, appraisal, a little bit of background on the region, and then we're going to open it up to your questions for the balance of our hour together. I'd like to introduce Dr. Coyle. Some of you, I can see who are alums, have had him as a professor, so you will know him well. But Dr. Jim Coyle is the former chair of the World Affairs Council for Orange County. He has been a faculty member here for many years, specifically in the International Relations National Security track. He leads our capstone course for students seeking careers in international relations, the intelligence agencies, and national security. In particular, the reason I was hoping Dr. Coyle could speak to us is because of his particular expertise in this region, which includes authoring the book, Russia's Border Wars and Frozen Conflicts from 2017, revised in 2018, has written a number of essays and journal articles about the region. As you can see, he speaks or reads Turkish, Persian, and French in varying degrees of proficiency, received his bachelor degree in the Foreign Service from Georgetown, his MPA from Temple, and a PhD in political science from my alma mater, George Washington University. Again, very excited and grateful for Dr. Coyle, who is checking in remotely to lead this conversation. Jim, again, why don't we begin with some comments and background on the region and what you're seeing, and then we will open it up to questions. I'll just say that if you'd like to ask questions as we're moving along, the chat feature is available to you. I'll moderate that and introduce questions as we have them. But again, I think we're a small enough group here that as Jim wraps up his remarks, we can go to a pretty casual question and answer period. So Dr. Coyle, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Peterson. Actually, this group is about the same size as my capstone class right now, so I'm pretty comfortable with it. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak to the larger Pepperdine community with whom I've had a relationship now for over 20 years. I think my first class at Pepperdine was in the first semester that you're in the new building after leaving the law school's environs. So I've long cherished my association with you. So I'm going to make some remarks. My remarks may be controversial to some of you. They're my remarks. They're not Pepperdine's remarks. So if you're going to shoot anybody, shoot me, not them. And I was trying to decide how to approach this question. And I decided that I would begin with a review of history. But that raises the question, where do I begin? Should I begin with St. Vladimir's conversion to Christianity in 988, which is the formation of the Russian Orthodox Church, which took place in Kiev? Or how about with the move of the Orthodox Church from Kiev to Russia during the Mongol invasions? Or with Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev? After all, Putin has placed part of the blame on all of them for the situation today. No, I begin with 1989. In the East, the last Soviet soldier passed over the Friendship Bridge, ending Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and sounding the death knell for Reagan's evil empire. In the West, KGB Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Putin, assigned as resident in Dresden, watched the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the socialist paradise of East Germany. He later would call the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. In order to guarantee unification, Chancellor Helmut Kohl pledged Moscow that he would not allow NATO troops to be deployed east of the East German-West German border. US Secretary of State James Baker traveled to the Kremlin and promised Gorbachev personally that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. NATO Secretary General repeated this pledge several months later. Within 2 years, however, NATO began discussions with Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Despite numerous statements from Russian leaders that expansion of NATO threatened the vital interests of the Russian Federation, all 3 were admitted into the alliance in 1999. Then 7 more countries further east, including the former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and finally, Albania and Croatia in 2009. The United States said that the not 1 inch comment was never meant to be a document or a treaty. President Putin just said we lied. It was too much for Putin. At the Munich Security Conference of 2007, he unleashed a torrent of criticism at the West in general, and America specifically. The United States was too powerful. It was acting as a global hegemon. It was intervening in countries like Iraq against the will of the world community. Most importantly, it was ignoring the wishes of a Russia that was destined to be a great power in a multipolar world. Our response? In April 2008, NATO held a summit meeting in Bucharest, Romania. Radu, I think you were there, yes? No. It promised NATO membership to the former Soviet republics of Georgia and Ukraine, although it did not offer a membership action plan to either country. President George W. Bush tried to explain the decision to President Putin. According to an eyewitness of his response, in 2008, Putin said Ukraine was an artificial country, and if NATO tried to give it membership status, then Ukraine would cease to exist. 2008. A month later, the United States was anxious to pacify the Balkans. War had started and stopped there at least twice. And so the US recognized a part of the Republic of Serbia, the ethnically Albanian Muslim majority province of Kosovo, as an independent country. Russia was outraged that a Slavic brother nation could be dismembered without the consent of the central government. 3 months later, Russia followed America's example and recognized 2 regions that had broken away from Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as independent republics. The Russian president, he has a long list of grievances, and some of them are justified. Does that mean that Russia is also justified in attacking and dismembering Ukraine? Certainly not. But Putin miscalculated how the West would respond to his actions in his self-proclaimed sphere of influence. After all, there's a long history of post-Soviet Russian interventions in ethnic conflicts. In March 1990, the Russian 14th Army fought the central government of Moldova to establish the breakaway region of Transnistria. Russian troops are there today as peacekeepers. The West looked the other way. In 1992, dissatisfied with Georgia's attempts to be free of Moscow's domination, Russia sent troops to fight on behalf of Abkhazian independence. When President Shevardnadze reversed his position and announced that Georgia would join the Commonwealth of Independent States, Russia reversed itself and fought against the Abkhazians. Russian troops are there today. The West looked the other way. Also in 1992 and extending till 1994, Russian troops fought on both sides in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. No matter who won on the battlefield, the ultimate winner was the Kremlin. Today, 5,000 troops remain in Armenia to protect that country from a supposed Turkish threat. Additional 2,000 troops are in Azerbaijan as peacekeepers. The West looks the other way. In 2008, Russia's gaze returned to Georgia. Inciting President Saakashvili to attack South Ossetia to stop the burning of ethnic Georgian villages, Russia defeated the Georgian military and, as I already mentioned, recognized the separatist regions as independent republics. Russian troops remain in the region, and the West looked the other way. In 2014, after the Rose Revolution, when the Russian-backed president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, fled the country to the safety of Moscow, Russia invaded Crimea using its little green men. Russia said the government of Ukraine was illegitimate, but it did say it would respect the results of the new elections. Instead, Russia annexed Crimea and supported an insurgency in the Donbass. When the Ukrainian army was on the verge of defeat of the insurgency in Donetsk and Luhansk, in 2015, Russia sent a force of 40,000 men across the border. They fought the Ukrainian army to a standstill. It then withdrew the troops and claimed they were never there in the first place. The leadership of the separatist militias remained Russian military officers. The West looked the other way. Russia's like an interventionist addict, constantly needing a bigger fix, a deeper involvement in the affairs of its neighbor. Putin dictated the Second Minsk Protocol to both sides. It was supposed to be a blueprint to end the fighting. But Putin also made sure that the protocol would never be implemented, insisting that his puppets have autonomy and veto power over Ukraine's decisions before he would pull out his troops and return control of Ukraine's borders to the government. The West looked the other way. Even a month ago, Putin said that both sides must implement Minsk. Using vulgar language with sexual overtones, he lectured President Zelensky. "You have to take it, my dear." A week later, he tore up Minsk by invading. It's easy to see why Vladimir Putin believed his current invasion of Ukraine would not be challenged. Nothing he or his predecessors had done in the near abroad had ever been challenged. The West looked the other way. While Putin may believe he was justified in dismembering an artificial state, however, there is a long history of Russia recognizing Ukraine's right to exist. The USSR signed the Helsinki Act in 1975 and was a member of the United Nations. As such, Russia, as a successor state to the Soviet Union, is pledged to refrain from any intervention, direct or indirect, in the internal or external affairs of another participating state. The Belovezh Accord, signed on 8 December 1991, is the document that dissolved the Soviet Union. It was signed by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. This was followed by the Alma-Ata protocols that founded the Commonwealth of Independent States. Again, Russia and Ukraine are both signatories of the document. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine overnight became the third largest nuclear power in the world. Although it had the warheads and it had the missiles, but the Kremlin had the launch codes. After strenuous negotiations, Ukraine agreed to transfer the weaponry to Russia. This was memorialized in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia, the US, and the UK reaffirmed, quote, their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. Finally, in 1997, Russia and Ukraine signed a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and partnership, in which both sides agreed to respect the territorial integrity and the inviolability of the borders of the countries involved. Russia allowed the treaty to expire in 2018, but it was still in effect in 2014 when it seized Crimea and began supporting insurgencies in the Donbass. Even after the treaty expired, though, under international law, its recognition of the borders of Ukraine remains rock solid. So the question remains, why now? Why would Putin invade now? Well, there's a number of reasons. First, Putin recently asked Zelensky to take a neutrality pledge. The Ukrainian president replied that membership in NATO was in the Ukrainian constitution and was his country's future. Interestingly, according to press reports, Zelensky has now agreed to this demand, but Putin wants more now that he's committed his military forces. Second, the United States is providing Ukraine with training and with Javelin anti-tank missiles. This decreased Ukraine's vulnerability to potential military threats and Russian influence. Third, tired of Russia constantly playing the ethnic card in the East, for the past several months, Zelensky has been playing the ethnic card himself, appealing to minority populations in the Middle Volga region of the Russian Federation to claim their rights against Great Russian expansionism. Fourth, Russia is at its height of its energy-based power. As its ability to continue to produce oil and gas declines, the lifeblood of its economic and military might, Russia finds itself in a use it or lose it situation if it wants to project great power status. And finally, Afghanistan. Putin sensed the Western alliance lacked leadership and was in disarray. This was the time to press his expansionist claims. Where do we go from here? Good question. With the Kremlin waving the threat of nuclear annihilation like a child's toy, the West has been careful to avoid challenging Russian troops directly. This has resulted in NATO relying on the outgunned Ukrainian army to do the fighting for us. They're doing a heck of a job. The Ukrainians have fought valiantly. I fear, however, that their days are numbered. Until the Ukrainian army meets what may be their inevitable fate, however, the West should continue to provide them with whatever munitions they need. This must be done, however, without crossing an unknown Russian threshold. Russian military doctrine and its national security strategy both approve the first use of nuclear weapons if Russian interests are threatened. The problem is nobody knows what is meant by the term Russian interests. The only person that can make that decision is President Putin. And that, I contend, is a scary situation. We have to shore up NATO's eastern defenses. The withdrawal of troops from Europe that began with the fall of the Soviet Union must be reversed, lest we fall short of Article 5 needs to be invoked. We don't want a new Cold War, but a new hot war would be even worse. Of course, this won't protect Ukraine today, but it will protect the United States and its NATO allies. Yes, we have put crippling sanctions on Russia that will make the country pay a terrible price. Sadly, the ones that will be hurt the most are the Russian people, including those valiant protesters being arrested for opposing the war. Some of these new sanctions bite the elite, however, such as their inability to use the banking system to access their money squirreled away in Cyprus and other locations. Bear in mind, however, this is Russia, not the United States. The oligarchs depend on Putin for their access to power and wealth, Putin does not depend on the oligarchs. And Europe still needs Russian energy. China has recently signed an agreement to purchase more Russian gas. It means the world will continue to finance 43% of the Kremlin's budget. I'll advance a provocative argument based on Henry Kissinger's years as National Security Advisor. Those of you that were my students know I loved Henry Kissinger in the old days. He advocated two strategies simultaneously: triangulation and linkage. Triangulation: use friendly relations with China to limit Russia. Use friendly relations with Russia to limit China. Of course, this is a long-term strategy that, again, won't help Ukraine today. If performed successfully, however, it will manage both of those potential threats to our own security. It requires better relations with both countries. Russia's competition with China for influence in Central Asia offers hope for success in that strategy. To give you a couple of examples, Kazakhstan did not support Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, although they remained silent. Uzbekistan today condemned the invasion and condemned the attempts to seize the Donbass. Similarly, the fact that China did not take advantage of the current Ukraine crisis to invade Taiwan, and recent comments by the Chinese ambassador in Great Britain that China does not support the special military operation and China does support the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, it shows there might be room for cooperation. It'll be interesting to hear the readout of President Biden's discussion today with President Xi. Linkage. This is probably the most controversial. We need to remind Putin that Japan has claims to the Kuril Islands, that Chechens desire independence, that there are minorities in the Middle Volga, that Kaliningrad used to be called Königsberg, and that St. Petersburg was once a Swedish trading post. Russia's not the only one that can play at this historical game. I don't want to end this on a too bellicose a note. This war has to end. President Putin needs an exit ramp, what Sun Tzu referred to as the golden bridge, that allows him to declare victory and go home, even if he does not meet all of his war aims. We have to convince him that there are more benefits to him to ending the conflict than he still hopes to obtain by continuing the conflict. A new arms agreement, a promise of no attack against Russia, the Ukrainian declaration of neutrality. I'm not sure, but Putin has to have something that allows him to save face domestically and that allows him that he will achieve something from his military attacks. Let me conclude my remarks with a single phrase: Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Really appreciate the table that you've set here for the conversation. Again, we welcome questions either via the chat feature or if you'd like to raise your hand through the reaction tab, and I'll happy to call on you. We have a couple screens here, so I hope not to miss you. Dr. Coyle, let me begin with the first question. You mentioned before the prospects for engaging China in these discussions, and that they could be seen as ones that obviously have a degree of influence with Russia. It appears that, as is their want, they appear to be speaking out of both sides of their mouth as it relates to their feelings and support of Russia. How do you see the prospects for engaging China, and is that America's role there? Obviously, the president meets with President Xi today, or are there others who should be involved?
Wow, that's a good question. Yes, they are talking out of both sides of their mouth. Putin has asked China to provide military equipment to Russia, which, by the way, I think is a tremendous comment on the situation of the Russian military, that he has to turn to China to get additional supplies. China has not ruled it out. However, China hasn't said yes either. And what China has done is issue this statement in Britain, it was either yesterday or today, saying that China recognizes Ukrainian right to exist. China and Ukraine have a lot of economic ties. I believe China is Ukraine's #1 trading partner. And so they're reluctant to jeopardize that. On the other hand, they don't want to anger Putin, who only a month ago they pledged eternal friendship with. We have to remember that China needs a lot of natural resources for its economy. And China is also a very good, I'm wandering a little bit from your question, but China is also a very good negotiator. There's the Power of Siberia gas pipeline that had been built for 20 years and had never been filled because China would not meet the Russian price. But when Russia invaded the first time and seized Crimea, all of a sudden Russia agreed to China's price. And similarly now, there's 2 lines to the Power of Siberia. And a month before this military action, Russia agreed to China's price on the second one. So China knows how to play hardball when it wants to. And I find it encouraging that China hasn't been more aggressively in favor of this. China's backing off a little bit. Originally, they called this special military operation, which is Putin's language. They also said they understood why Russia was doing what it did. It has stopped making statements like that. And instead, it's talked about how it supports Ukraine. Whose job is it to engage China? Well, for this particular war, it's probably Zelensky more than anybody else that needs to engage. But if you're talking about long-term, what the relationship would be in I hate to use the term New World Order, then that's the United States, because the United States can play the role of the pivot, can play the role of the offshore balancer that it has tried to be over the years.
We've got a number of questions now coming in. I want to go to SPP alum and board member Jason Pates. Jason.
Hi, everyone. Hey, Professor Coyle, thank you so much for taking your time and talking about this topic today. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Loud and clear.
Excellent. So yes, I was a member of the inaugural class, ended up falling in love with one of my Ukrainian classmates and marrying her while I was at SPP. We were married right there in the chapel, and I believe some of my distinguished guests at that wedding are even here on the call. Hi, Catherine, and others. So anyway, I have a natural bias here, but I have some comments, and I really appreciate you bringing this topic to bear. And in regards to what we heard from China today, it's pretty clear that China is going to play both sides on this. They're on the one hand saying, they said to President Biden today that this war is in the interest of no one. On the other hand, if you've been watching any, and most of us probably have not, but if you've been watching television in China, state-run television has been just running all of the Russian propaganda regularly on the news. So they're playing both sides of this, and I don't think that they or anybody yet knows what the result of this is going to be. And so I'm not expecting China to play a very large role, at least right now. But you know, we never know. As far as NATO is concerned, I believe, and I do have a question at the end of this, I absolutely promise. I believe that NATO has been a red herring in this argument that Putin has used to his own benefit for a very long time. We know that he does not have some intrinsic fear of NATO because NATO has never threatened Russia. And we know that even in 2018, when NATO asked to use Russian airspace and Russian airports to facilitate troop movement, et cetera, in Afghanistan, he was happy to oblige. So anybody that was really, truly fearful of NATO would never have allowed that. He did. And so this whole NATO conversation, I believe, is a ruse. And I also believe that goes even to the comment about whether or not the fact that the Ukrainian government has stated that they would not join NATO, and Putin wants to keep going because his troops are there. I think that just goes to show that NATO really has very little to do with this conflict whatsoever. I think the only thing NATO really has to do is it slows him down from reassembling the former Soviet states, which he acclaimed in his 10,000 word missive last summer, which was his goal, is to reassemble the states. Not to mention, of course, your great point that Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine is even a state whatsoever, and that ergo is what's leading us into this genocide, which is ongoing as we speak. It was Viktor Yanukovych, not Yushchenko, that fled Ukraine in 2014. I make that mistake all of the time. There's too many Victors. But anyway, I was lucky enough to be part of a delegation that monitored the elections back during the Orange Revolution in the mid 2000s, and obviously Ukraine has been putting forth a lot of effort to maintain its relationship with the West and to promise its people what they want to reach. So this leads me to my question. And by the way, we also saw today in Russia there was they claim there was 100,000 people in a rally to support Putin and in the effort in Ukraine in celebration of whatever they think that they're celebrating about Crimea. And so that goes to show that while there are many people willing to risk their lives to be arrested to support peace, there are also thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps millions in Russia that are supporting the effort and the attacks on Ukraine today. So my question is, in what I read just a few minutes ago was that the head of the president's office, Andrei Yermak, promised that the Ukrainian authorities would not agree to any truce with Russia that would contradict its sovereignty and its territorial integrity, which is of course consistent with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that you rightfully brought up. Where states like the US, the UK, and Russia, among others, gave security assurances to Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine's nuclear arsenal, an agreement that Ukraine undoubtedly regrets making today, even if they didn't have the codes at the moment, and given Russia's attacks. I believe that what the world is learning is that there's no agreement that supplants the value of a nuclear arsenal, including one with the United States. So my question to you is this: if the Ukraine is saying they're not going to give up Eastern Ukraine, they're not going to give up Crimea, and if they are at least leveraging this war into a stalemate, which is currently the status, and by the way, I do think that we've seen Putin bloviate constantly about nuclear attacks over the decades, including in Syria, before Turkey managed to shoot down. And when Putin said, "Anyone that touches my jets in Syria will pay the ultimate price." And so then Turkey went down and shot down one of Putin's jets, and nothing happened. I feel that there is a fair amount of bloviating that Putin is doing. I believe he's still a rational actor. I do not believe that a nuclear war is imminent. And I do believe we have to be careful about using the appeasement strategy that was unsuccessful during World War II. So my question for you is, what do you think if Ukraine is not going to give that up? Where is an end? And we talk about an end ramp. The end ramp for Putin is for him to back out of Ukraine, tell everybody that Ukraine has agreed never to join NATO, and that being the end of it. But as I don't believe that's going to happen. So my question to you is: do you believe that there is a chance that there will be some kind of regime change in Russia as a result of this that would end this? Because at this point we appear to be at a stalemate on the battlefield. Thank you for giving me so much time.
Well, Jason, I don't even know where to begin with all that. I will begin with your question, and then I'll try to hit all the other points. If I miss any, somebody please pull me in. I don't know if there'll be a regime change immediately. In many ways, there has never been a regime change in Russia in a situation like this. I mean, Putin stepped down because he was drunk. There was no other, he didn't really have any other options. I think the closest parallel to this would be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they did get rid of Khrushchev, and he's not even buried in the Kremlin, the only premier that's not buried in the Kremlin. But it took a while. I think it was 64, almost like 18 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that they finally replaced him. So I don't know. I don't. Based on history, the answer would be no, they're not going to replace Putin in the middle of this. On the other hand, there are some interesting signs that in the last few press conferences Putin has held. Previously, he always had his advisors behind him on screens, and the last few press conferences, he has not had the military advisors up there. So that could well indicate that there's a lot of opposition to what he's doing among the elites. Among the general public, you're absolutely right. There is a large number of Russians who support the president and his actions. There appears to be a small group of young people in Russia who get their news from social media, and they're the ones that are out protesting. And then there's the vast majority of older Russians who get their information from state-run news and television, and they're supporting it. I mean, after all, they're being told that their troops are there defending Russians from the neo-Nazi Ukrainian forces. I mean, who wouldn't support that, right? I mean, as for his threats, I think the shoot down of the MiG by Turkey is a bad example, because there were serious consequences. There were economic consequences, just like we're trying to do to Russia. And they were so severe that within a year, Erdogan traveled to Moscow and made a personal apology to Putin, and then things went back to normal. What else?
Well, let's just talk about the stalemate piece. Jason's point that we appear to be at a stalemate, that conflicts a bit with your earlier framing that things are heading in a particular direction. Certainly, it appears around Kyiv that is just going to be a meat grinder.
Yes.
If it is continued to be pressed. Do you buy the I want to get your assessment of how you see things on the battlefield currently. But secondly, do you agree with the perception on the part of several experts I've heard of that the longer this drags on, the greater the opportunity is for weapons to be supplied into Ukraine, the worse it becomes for Putin? Or if this continues to drag on, this only incentivizes Putin to consider nuclear or chemical weapons?
You know, I don't know about the chemical weapons piece. I recognize the fact that he has now charged Ukraine with making chemical biological weapons. Western analysts are saying, oh, that means he's preparing the groundwork for him to use chemical and biological weapons. Could be. I don't know, but I would point out that that analysis is coming from the West, that nobody in Russia is making that point. The stalemate, there's two wars going on simultaneously. There's the war, there's the propaganda war, and then there's the war on the battlefield. You could argue that Ukraine is winning the war on TikTok. Unfortunately, however, on the battlefield, it's a different situation. Russia's taking tremendous losses that it never anticipated in taking. But every single day, Russian troops have gained territory. Now, they wanted to do it with, a lightning strike that would decapitate the country in Kiev. They couldn't do it. They wanted to take and surround the major cities. They haven't been able to do it. And what they're doing is they're learning. They're learning as they go, and they're changing their tactics. I mean, 2 weeks ago, we were all watching that 40-mile convoy
Mhm.
That 40-mile convoy is gone. Now, a lot of it was blown up, but
Mm.
what's left has dispersed and is reforming as new military units, but no longer in a 40-mile line. Uh, they're relying more and more on long-range artillery, which does not really have much battlefield effectiveness. It's indiscriminate destruction. But with that indiscriminate destruction, um, they're succeeding. They're succeeding more from the south, and there are now troops coming up both sides of the Dnieper River, and that will eventually cut off the Ukrainian army that's fighting over on the Donbass, and then we'll shortly be able to. Yeah, I shouldn't say shortly, but if they continue their movement, we'll be able to significantly curtail the Western supply of weaponry.
Do you think
So
that
But is it,
sanctions will have any, to Pete's point, and I'll shut up, I promise. Do you think the sanctions help Ukraine's cause, or if this does continue to extend?
well, I would say it depends on how serious people are about the sanctions. Yes, it has hurt the oligarchs, but as I mentioned, the oligarchs aren't the ones that put Putin in power. It's Putin that put the oligarchs in power. I'll tell you a quick story about that. I was a guest of an oligarch in Moscow a few years ago, and he was telling me that there was a meeting where all the oligarchs had to go to the Kremlin to meet with Putin. And if you think of it the way Americans think about American donors going to meet the president, you expect the president to glad hand them and say thank you for your support. This guy told me that in the waiting room, people were sweating bullets, that because every single one of them knew that their whole lives and futures depended on what that guy in the other room said. So it's not the same at all. It hurts, but already they're starting to crumble. They never really took effect for oil and gas. And then on top of that, now within the European Union has divided into three parts now. One group, the Eastern countries, want even stronger sanctions. Another group led by Germany is now arguing that we need to find ways to reduce the effect of the sanctions because it's hurting their own economies. And then you have the vast majority of Europeans in the middle that don't take a position either way. So will it have a long-term effect? I think it's having a long-term effect on Russia's overall strength, but I don't know that it's enough to get rid of Putin. I don't know that it's enough to make Putin withdraw his armies. And yes, the longer we're there, we can get more armaments into Ukraine until the Russians cut that off. But it's also long-term, more of a chance that the Europeans will buckle as they have so many times in the past. Oh, you mentioned
Jim,
NATO.
we have a couple questions on NATO from Jacob and Maurice. Let's talk about NATO for a second. As you've discussed, that the NATO's role, we heard the German chancellor for the first time and sometimes stepping up to say that Germany is going to finally agree, we'll see if that actually happens, to its 2% budgetary commitments. Two questions. What is your view on how the Russian invasion has changed how the NATO nations view themselves and their commitments? And second, do you foresee a change in America's relationship with NATO because of the invasion?
Okay. I think it has galvanized Europe in a way that even shocks the Europeans. A month ago, Germany's projection was that it would meet its 2% commitment by 2050. 30 years from now. And all of a sudden, boom, it's going to be tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing. And you're right, if they actually pull through with this, it's a big deal. Um, I think it has made most of Western Europe recognize that their complacency that they've had since 1991 was misplaced. They always were looking at Russia as this stepchild, that if we just treat them a little bit better, they'll learn their manners, and then we can let them sit at the dinner table with the rest of us. And now they found out that, you know what, that problem child doesn't want to sit at the dinner table. He wants to throw stuff at the wall.
Mm.
I think that's a really amazing wake up for the Europeans.
Mm.
I think it's also a wake up for the United States. We have been pulling troops out of Europe ever since 1991, and suddenly we're reversing that. And now, how much will we reverse it? I mean, still, we have a total of 2,000 troops that are on rotation through Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland, because we're trying to honor the idea that we don't have military that close to Moscow. Poland is begging for more troops. I believe we're sending another couple thousand there now. I think Romania has offered us a permanent military base.
Mm.
I mean, these are major changes
Mhm.
that I think this administration is going to have to take seriously.
Mm. A couple of videos that have been making rounds I've seen on social media. One related to what you were just talking about is the rather strange press conference open discussion between President Trump, then President Trump, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and other American delegates, along with their counterparts from Germany, about the German purchase of natural gas and oil, and the fact that they weren't maintaining their NATO commitments. That's one. The other is what appears to be another very strange, in light of current events, conversation that was at the Council for Foreign Relations with then not even a candidate, Joe Biden, and Richard Haas, talking about Ukraine. And mentioned in that, and I had reason to review the entire 15 minutes or so of the one clip, we may not have had a US president who has been to Ukraine more than President Biden has. He mentioned in the comments that he's been there at least a dozen times. There was the discussion that many of us might remember about where he kind of casually said about the decision whether to withhold $1 billion in aid, and unless a certain prosecutor was removed, and SOB, he says that decision was made and the money was released. Do you see anything unique in President Biden's relationship or knowledge of Ukraine that you have seen either expressed in some of his discussions about that region, or any unique knowledge of the players there? We also know about the president's son, board member Keith Tobias, raises that question, and the Ukrainian oil companies or energy companies. Anything unique about President Biden's distinctive experience in that part of the world that can serve us well?
I'm trying to think how to answer you, Pete. I don't want to go into a partisan minefield here. I don't think the president's knowledge of foreign policy has done much to benefit the United States in general. And so I would say the same for Ukraine as well. He seems to react rather than act. And because of that, we're always a day late and a dollar short. If you look at Afghanistan, most of my students know, past and present, that I always felt we should be out of Afghanistan in 2002 because we went into Afghanistan to capture bin Laden, and by 2002 we knew he wasn't there. So, should we have gotten out? Yeah, we should have. But should we have done it the way we did it just because the president said, I want out of this? No, we shouldn't. And I think that's the way he makes his decisions. So there was very little help to Ukraine before the Russians had invaded. If there had been more aid to the Ukraine before the Russians had invaded, more aid, not just under the Biden administration, but under several administrations, going back to 2008. 2008, they took Crimea, and the president at that time offered them shoes. Well, they didn't need shoes. They needed Javelin missiles, but they got shoes. So it goes back over several administrations of both parties that we really have not given Ukraine the aid they need. That being said, and you hint at it over the prosecutor, Ukraine's always had a problem with corruption. And as long as it's got that problem with corruption, there's a disconnect between the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. And Clausewitz says that you need to have unity between the people, the army, and the government. And without that unity, we could have given all the help we wanted. And I don't think it would have been successful. One of the amazing things about President Zelensky, and I think it speaks to his genuineness, is he has been able to rally the people, because by his staying there, he has shown that some things are more than just who's benefiting from what oil concession.
Yeah, that don't get me a plane ticket. Don't get me a plane ticket. Get me some weapons. That's going to go down as one of the great responses in public leadership. Through the benefits of this online Zoom platform that we have, and we're in our last 10 minutes here, we are hearing from SPP alum Radu Oprea, who is in Romania. And I just wanted to read part of his question here. He is seeing, due to the proximity to Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine have entered Romania. We know over 1 million have entered into Poland. Can you talk a bit about the human crisis that we're seeing here in that region that is being borne by neighboring states? Is it something that you see is going to be a long-term crisis with neighboring countries absorbing refugees, or do you see a time when, if however this is resolved, that these refugees would return? How do you think that the neighboring countries are doing in responding to this crisis that's been forced upon them as well?
Europe has a need for workers because Europe is an aging population. One of the reasons why Angela Merkel allowed all those Syrian refugees to come to Germany, the ones that walked across Europe, was because they needed workers in the factories to pay Social Security for all the aging Germans that are living the good life. That hasn't changed. And so Europe has the ability, I believe, to absorb a large number of the population, of this refugee population. Problems. Number one, most of these are not working age men that would want to go into the factories, but rather it's women and children. And so at least initially, they're going to be a fairly big drain on the social welfare system in Europe. And the other thing is, there is a question about capacity. Yes, Europe can absorb a number of refugees, but how much is enough? We're talking about close to 3 million refugees right now have crossed the border. And if there is a relative peace established, I think in Ukraine, I I think most would go back, but I don't know. I mean, I think everybody agrees that a peace is not coming to Ukraine because Russia is not going to withdraw its military. Eventually, they will succeed in conquering the country. They will not be able to hold the country. And what you're going to end up with is partisan warfare. And under that condition, how many refugees will go home? I think some will, but I don't think they all will. The imbalance, the refugee imbalance, is one of the reasons why the United States got involved in Libya. So many Libyans were getting ready to, Libyan refugees were starting to flood Italy, which was a NATO country. We thought it was going to destabilize the country. So I think it is something, it's a serious question that I don't think many people are paying attention to. How much is enough? Because I think they're here for the long haul.
Well, I think that leads us to the last question. And Jim, I want to thank you for really a great presentation and engagement on this. And thanks all for joining us here. You say that things are on a path here for Russia to be victorious militarily. At the same time, this bifurcation between so-called military victory and ability to govern seem like two very different things.
Yep.
And again, just to point out the example of Kyiv, the thought that that place could be militarily dominated and governed, I just don't see how that happens. And
look at our own experience in Iraq, right? We were able to conquer Iraq in a military campaign that will be studied in military academies for years to come. It was brilliant.
Yeah.
We couldn't hold on to the country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so does it just become a permanent state of war and guerrilla conflict there? Is that where this appears to be happening? If Putin is not going to pull out, yet he is continuing to put military resources into a country that he can't govern, I don't understand the end game here unless it's just a permanent state of conflict there.
Well, the end game, the proposed end game that Putin had was that Ukraine was actually a bunch of people that love Russia and would be liberated by them in a couple of weeks, and they'd be greeted as saviors. Same thing with us in Iraq. We actually thought that it was World War II, and that the French would all have American flags in their hand to welcome the welcome the Allies. And of course, it didn't happen.
Right.
So now we're faced with countrywide what has been the situation in the Donbass since 2014. We talk about a frozen conflict. It's not frozen over there. Never has been. There's been active fighting over there for 8 years. Now it's going to be active fighting through the rest of the country as well.
Well, I hate to end it on that note, but I think it's important that we understand the stakes and to hear from someone like you, Jim, who is expert in this region. Again, I want to thank you for this time. Thank you all, friends, alumni. Great to see so many of you, current students, supporters, board members. Thank you all for joining us. We have recorded this to make it available to others. And again, it's important that we, as we so often do at the Policy School, understand that current events didn't start that way. These things date back years, if not century and millennia, as you began the conversation here, Jim. And so thank you so much for providing us with your expertise here. And we look forward to staying in touch as events unfold. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.